Please stand by. We'll start in just a few seconds, giving everyone time to click that Got It button and join with computer audio. Well, good morning, good afternoon. I'm not sure what you say at exactly noon, which one is appropriate, but welcome to, I counted, week 40 of the University of Buffalo School of Management Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness, 52 weeks of leadership program. Thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your bright, in Buffalo at least, Monday morning or afternoon to join us. We'd like to thank our title sponsor, Geico Careers, who's made this all possible and made it possible for us not only to continue to do this, but to provide it to you free of charge and to make all the recordings available for all the 52 weeks, well, almost all of them, on our website, as well as a couple of bonus episodes. Just Google 52 Weeks of Leadership and you'll go right to it. It is my privilege to introduce today's speaker. It's a repeat speaker. He's been on with us a couple of times on the 52 Weeks of Leadership, Dean Paul Teslick, and I just lost my notes here that I wanted to make sure that I said. He's going to be talking to us today a little bit about lessening the load, practical steps to facilitate shared leadership. You know, most people don't realize this. We don't talk up our own faculty enough, and Paul is humble enough that he'd never mentioned this, but he really is known worldwide as one of the world's most respected authorities on this whole idea of how we develop leaders and how we develop leadership even in people who aren't in leadership roles. However, this can cause a bit of a burden. This can be rough on people. Leadership is not easy work. He just published some research on this as well as a piece in HBR, and he's going to talk a little bit about it today. If you've been living under a rock, haven't been with us for the previous installments, Dr. Teslick is a professor and dean here with a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology from Penn State. We won't hold that against him. He was named dean here in April 2016, so he's been around for 5 years. Again, you know, I can't tell people outside of academic circles just how widely respected he is all across the world. He's won the UB Award, Exceptional Scholar Award for Sustained Achievement, which is tremendously rare. He's an elected fellow of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, the Society for Organizational Behavior. When I was in grad school, he ran the Organizational Behavior Division for our most prestigious organization, the Academy of Management. Dude, this guy knows what he's talking about, and he's our dean. How cool is that? So that said, take it away, Paul.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks everyone for joining today of 52 Weeks of Leadership. Now, all of a sudden, I feel suddenly very old after Jim's introduction. I appreciate what Jim was saying about kind of the work that we've been doing in the area of shared leadership, but it really has been a shared research undertaking, and this particular aspect of shared leadership, which is really, as Jim was alluding to, is how while there are a lot of positives that are associated with shared leadership, it can come at a cost to informal leaders, the people who do step up and provide leadership where and when it's needed. We often talk about the benefits of shared leadership when informal leaders stand up and take an important informal leadership role. But it does come at a cost. And this research is actually really been led by a former PhD student who is now a tenured faculty member at University of South Australia, Chad Chu, and with some other authors that have been involved in this research. And I won't go into detail, of course, talking about the specifics of the research itself. What I'm going to try and do is focus a little bit more on some of the practical implications. And we do have a recently published short HBR piece that talks about that. And I think that was circulated on LinkedIn, and I'll make sure that I drop that into the chat at some point if you have an interest in looking at that. So I think at this point, everyone is familiar with the tremendous amount of change that has been taking place. A lot of these were trends that were happening before the pandemic, but they've really been accelerating during the course of the pandemic. And of course, the talk now is, what's the new normal going to look like as we work and live in a world that is increasingly complex and where work now is defined by more complex and ambiguous tasks. We're working in an environment that is increasingly dynamic and difficult to be able to predict. We work where teams are now working not only co-located, but connected through technology and working in virtual teams, which means the ability to be able to bring in expertise wherever it might be located across the globe in this type of differentiated, distributed system of teamwork. And organizations are becoming flatter also. And part of that is also a function of it's difficult to be able to identify and bring in and retain the type of talent that we need. And so people are getting stretched in more and more ways as well. The overall implication of all of this is that we're seeing a real fundamental shift in terms of what leadership looks like. And part of this shift, I think, is around the notion of bringing in and increasing the circle of leadership to involve those who before haven't necessarily been in roles where there is leadership expectations as part of what they're doing. So this importance of shared leadership and informal leadership is something that we're seeing as a significant trend and an evolution of leadership from something that looks more like this, where you have a kind of a leader situated above the team who's providing direction and providing specifics for how the team needs to go about doing their work, to something that looks more maybe like this, where you have a leader who is situated above the team, but where these red lines here indicate the amount of leadership that's happening informally within the team. And that's an evolution in leadership that we're seeing take place. So this notion of kind of shared leadership, which I'll just kind of try and spend just a second talking about, looks something like this, where you have leaders, team members who are sometimes stepping forward to provide influence in a particular task or a situation that needs leadership, needs some effective influence, needs effective communication, needs focus to be able to get something done. And because they have the expertise that's right in the moment, they step forward and provide that influence, whereas others will maybe step back and allow that person to be the leader in the moment where it's necessary and be able to take direction from that peer. So that form of shared leadership, if you kind of think about it as this network of influence that's happening within the team, can be really important and helpful in terms of greater utilization of knowledge and expertise. It helps build strong team identification and commitment and mutual accountability. And one of the things that we know in the research is that shared leadership is associated with higher outcomes in terms of team performance and responsiveness. And at the same time, as we kind of alluded to at the beginning, this form of shared leadership really requires individuals to be able to provide informal leadership. So what I have up here on kind of this slide is kind of looking at this one particular team member with the blue hexagon background. If you look at the kind of the arrows there, that's indicating the amount of leadership to the peers in the team that person is exerting. And you'll notice more outgoing arrows from that person to the others compared to the other members of the team. That's kind of a way of depicting this notion of informal leadership within a team that's experiencing shared leadership. So what does that mean? Well, you have someone here who's seen as a group leader by her or his peers, even if they don't necessarily have formal authority. And as you would kind of guess by the amount of influence that they're having with their other members of their team, they have more power, more status, more reputation within the team. And again, there's positive things that are associated with that. We know that when people are seen and recognized as informal leaders, they tend to experience greater levels of commitment, higher performance, and they contribute more to the overall effectiveness of the team. And at the same time, something that hasn't been looked at very carefully is what might be some of the costs or some of the burdens of serving as an informal leader. And that was really kind of the question that my colleagues and I were interested in better understanding. And so down here at the bottom, I have the details about the study. And I won't go into the specifics of it, except that there were 4 parts to this study. We actually did 4 separate studies as part of this larger overall program of research in this article. And each study built upon the next to try and really unpack and understand what are some of the burdens of informal leadership and how can organizations and formal leaders be able to address some of those burdens that are associated with informal leadership. What we found in our first study that we did, which was just to explore what are some of the burdens, if there are any at all, or is it all positive? Is being an informal leader only a good thing in terms of greater levels of commitment, greater levels of engagement, greater levels of performance and contributions to a team? Or might there be some hidden costs involved? One of the things that we speculated on was that when team members take on these informal leadership roles, like they're seen as the person who, when there's conflict in the team, steps in and mediates and resolves that conflict. Or when there's ambiguity in the team in terms of what direction to take, for instance, in engaging with a new client, they set up a way to be able to coordinate the activities that are happening within the team and provide informal leadership in that form. Whatever that informal leadership exactly looks like, consistently going above and beyond, our speculation was that ultimately comes at a cost. And that comes at a cost in terms of absorbing people's energy and eventually being able to deplete those resources. If there isn't a way to be able to help them maintain those energy levels and help be able to buffer some of the demands that come about as a result of being an informal leader. And that's actually what we found, was this relationship that higher levels of informal leadership were associated with higher levels of energy depletion, exhaustion, and ultimately lower levels of engagement and satisfaction over time. And that was something that we then explored further in the follow-up pieces of this research, which were done in studies 2, 3, and 4. In study 2, we went in and used an in-depth interview methodology, a qualitative approach, and we interviewed a large number of informal leaders. And what we consistently found was a theme that's kind of reflected in this quote here, which really reflects that when informal leaders consistently engage and step up and provide leadership for their team, that it can often be associated with losing energy, losing enthusiasm, and ultimately leading to burnout, exhaustion, and greater levels of dissatisfaction over time, if there aren't ways to be able to buffer that. And that's where the role of formal leaders comes into play. In our 3rd and 4th studies, one of the things that we were interested in is what's the role of formal leaders in trying to help address and lessen some of these burdens that informal leaders can often experience. And what we found was that in the first study, we went back into the field. In other words, we went back to a large sample of teams across a variety of organizations, and we looked at the degree to which formal leaders, so a formal manager or person higher in the organizational hierarchy, when they were providing support to that team, what did that do in terms of the burden that informal leaders experienced? Our prediction was that when formal leaders are providing that support, it helps dissipate some of that burden that we see as a result of informal leaders taking on a lot of leadership responsibility within a team. And that's actually what we found. And then in the 4th study, we actually did a manipulation. We did a kind of some scenarios where we manipulated the degree of formal leadership support, and we replicated what we found in real organizational settings. And that gave us some really strong evidence to be able to make firmer causal conclusions about the important role that formal leaders can play in being able to offset some of the burdens of informal leadership. Specifically, some things that we found that were important for formal leaders to do in terms of helping to lessen the load of informal leadership. One was be a leadership coach. A lot of people who take on informal leadership, they have real strengths when it comes to operational areas, when it comes to exercising technical expertise. But being in a situation where now you have to provide influence in a situation, for instance, that involves managing conflict or a negotiation situation, or where now you have to communicate above and beyond technical or operational issues and have to be able to communicate kind of a vision or some strategy to other people in your team or those outside the team. Those are things where, with less experience, an informal leader can really get caught up and tripped up, and where coaching can be very important from that formal leader. So again, kind of shifting the way in which formal leaders help and support their team from one that's more directive to one that's in a more supporting leadership coach type of approach. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of attention now to coaching programs for those who don't necessarily want to be professional coaches, but they do want to be able to be stronger in terms of building and developing their coaching skills, because that's becoming an increasingly important piece of being a successful leader of teams in an organization and helping to support informal leadership for those below you. Something else that we found that was important was being able to communicate up front your expectations as a formal leader of what should informal leadership look like. What are the boundaries? What are the areas where informal leadership is important and where you expect your informal leaders to exert influence? Where are the areas where they need to come to you for direction and help? But along with those expectations also needs to be granting trust for informal leaders to be able to then exert the type of influence once those guidelines, those expectations are set, so that there isn't a feeling of being micromanaged. That was one theme that we had from our interview phase of our research, was that one of the things that saps energy more than anything else that we found in our own research was when formal leaders say, I really need you to step up and to be able to do this important assignment. And then they start micromanaging it because then you've got all of the responsibility, but none of the authority to go along with that. And that was something that can be very frustrating for someone who's stepping up and trying to provide informal leadership. So it goes back to being an effective coach, communicating those expectations. And then a third is helping to lessen the load by building more informal leaders, building that pipeline of informal leadership talent so that it's not just one or two go-to people on your team. You're building the entire team to be able to step up when they need to, and thereby have a stronger network of leaders distributed across your entire team. There's also a role here for informal leaders to be able to help themselves. One of the things that we found in our research that helped mitigate some of the burdens of being an informal leader was when informal leaders were self-aware and able to manage their own energy levels. So understanding when you are feeling exhausted and knowing how to be able to either reach out for help, be able to kind of pull back a little bit to be able to make sure that you don't fall into that downward spiral of exhaustion and burnout. So that's kind of one thing. Kind of complementing that is then being able to be proactive and take positive steps to be able to rejuvenate your energy levels and your engagement. And that can range, of course, from anything from the things that help you be able to do that. For some people, that might be kind of adding a regular exercise routine or starting yoga or meditation or journaling, or some other system to be able to kind of help you be able to focus on your own energy and your own engagement. And that's something that formal leaders often learn through experience, but again, something informal leaders don't necessarily have some background or experience set to become self-aware of. And something else I see effective coaches often do is help provide suggestions on how to build your own informal advisory council. So through building, enhancing your mentor network, looking at peers to be able to be as sources of support, forming your own advisory council of people who are your kind of go-tos that you can reach out to if you're feeling frustrated by something and you want to have a kind of a confidential conversation. Knowing who that right person can be can make a world of difference in terms of thinking through something or just being able to get something off your chest and feeling better about it. So some things that we've kind of found in some of our research, and hopefully this is helpful. Again, in kind of the spirit of 52 weeks, keeping this short. If there are comments or questions, happy to wrap up and go to any of that.
Well, thank you, Paul. That's really interesting research and some good practical tips that we can take away. We've got, I see one question that's come in on the chat, but I had a few more that have come in on the private chat to me. Towards the beginning of your presentation, Martin asked, does the idea of shared leadership conflict with the idea of a clear chain of command?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I think there's different ways to kind of think about that, and would be interested in others' reactions to this. On the one hand, you might think that kind of shared leadership means that you really have kind of leadership coming from all different directions, and therefore it might be something that can interfere with a clear chain of command. But another way of looking at it is that when formal leaders in that chain of command are providing these elements of support, when they're providing elements of empowerment and engagement, and they're providing the right level of engagement, it actually helps that chain of command be that much more resilient and dynamic, because you've got alignment between the formal leaders in the chain of command and the teams that they direct and that they manage. What is different is how that chain of command might function. Whereas in kind of the traditional hierarchical style, it's really on the one end of the extreme, it can be command and control, but it's much more of a directive form of leadership. In the other, that chain of command really looks much more, that's empowering, that is providing direction. But again, it is doing that by also providing expectations for informal leadership and how shared leadership would function and serve in the team. So I think they actually complement each other, but it does mean that the chain of command looks different than it does or did in the kind of the traditional hierarchically structured organizational sense. I don't know, Jim, if you would agree with that yourself. I mean, you do a lot of work also in the area of shared leadership, and we've done some work on this topic together.
No, I think you wrapped it up pretty well. It's not necessarily, it would seem like it would conflict, but it doesn't necessarily have to, as long as everybody's on the same page, just to summarize. A related question actually came in while you were discussing the idea of setting boundaries around what is and isn't appropriate for informal leadership. Aaron asked, in your research, have you studied where those boundaries of informal leadership should be?
Yeah, so I think at the essence of leadership is influence. And so one way of maybe kind of thinking about that question is, what are the areas where influence is important for informal leaders to be able to be, to step up and be helpful? So some of that might be in managing how the team comes together and is be able to kind of tackle collective tasks that they need to be able to get done. So those areas of influence might be around team coordination, task coordination, communication. So kind of a great role for someone who's kind of a inexperienced leader but wants to be an emergent informal leader might be to take on the role of coordinating the team, providing the team minutes and the kind of a collective calendar for the team, and to make sure that team communications are crisp and clear and everyone's engaged, as an example. And as they develop greater levels of responsibility, maybe some of those areas of influence extend to working across teams, with other teams, or with clients or customers. I think it depends on the particular situation, but one way to think about that question might be in terms of what are the increasing levels of responsibility where influence is important, and have one build on the next, so that informal leaders are growing and developing their skills. And also at the same time, I saw another question that I think ties into this, is how do you encourage informal leadership that isn't in the form of a formal raise or promotion? It can be through stretch assignments that help people grow and develop new skills. So maybe it's not a promotion opportunity in the current team, but maybe it's helping them get set up for what's next for them in terms of their career in a different team, or in some new area that they're kind of excited about developing themselves professionally.
So actually, you took the next question I was going to ask you, because I thought it was a great one. Here's another one from Michelle. How do you encourage an informal leader to step back when they're overstepping with their peers? How do you set those boundaries without squashing their leadership inclinations? Nice phrase, Michelle.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And Jim, this reminds me of a study that you and I were recently involved in with our former PhD students, Ning and Hamed, where, if you recall in that research, one of the things that was helpful for shared leadership to come together effectively was for team members to understand who is most knowledgeable and expert in which particular areas in our team. And when team members have this, you can think about it as a mental model, a kind of a shared understanding of who is good at what. That helps them recognize situations where, let's say the team is working on a really tough technical issue at the time. The person who's most knowledgeable is expected to step up. And when everybody has a good understanding about who has that type of technical expertise, then they're more willing to stand back and kind of grant that type of influence to the person who has that expertise in the moment. Jim and I actually did a kind of a study looking at this, where we kind of saw that type of scenario take place. And what we found was that when teams have that collective understanding about who is good at what, and they value and they respect each other's knowledge and expertise, then they were more likely to be able to effectively respond to unpredictable challenges that face the team in the moment. And that's one of the potential strengths of shared leadership, is it can be a much more adaptive form of teamwork when, again, you have that collective knowledge and understanding about who's good at what.
One of my favorite quotes from Mother Teresa: I know things you do not, you know things I do not. Together we can accomplish great things. We're coming up on time. Let's see if we can fit in one more question. It's kind of a devil's advocate question here from Gina. How can we ensure that this concept of shared leadership doesn't just become a justification for organizations to take advantage of individuals without recognition or compensation?
No, that's a great question, Gina. So it goes back to trust, most certainly, and building on that trust and making sure that that trust is there and not broken, is that you do have to have that recognition. Compensation is certainly part of it, but I think part of that also is the informal recognition and acknowledgement about the accomplishments that informal leaders are able to achieve. But you're absolutely right that it has to also be paired with tangible outcomes, whether that be merit increases, whether that be promotion opportunities, whether that be opportunities to be able to take part in a really coveted training opportunity. Those types of things need to be there to be able to kind of recognize informal leaders. And that goes back again to the part about support that is so important that I mentioned earlier. But that's a great question. I think an organization that goes forward and tries to be able to wring out as much as it can from its people by setting up expectations of informal leadership and not recognizing, praising, and rewarding that is only setting itself up for burnout, frustration, exhaustion, and ultimately cynicism from the very people that they need to be engaged and provide leadership.
There you have it. Thank you very much, Paul. We know you've got a ludicrously busy schedule, so we always appreciate it when you can make time to join us for a half hour on a Monday.
Always a pleasure, and appreciate it, Jim, and thanks everyone for being on today.
So don't forget to tell your friends who missed it. This recording of this session will be available online on the 52 Weeks of Leadership website. You can just Google that phrase, it'll pop up. Just give us about a week or two to get closed captioning and things like that available. But in the meantime, coming up next Monday, we hope you'll join us again next Monday at 12. Lee Williams from the Dent Neurologic Institute, their General Counsel and Director of Business Development, will be joining us to talk about leading an age-diverse workplace. There's a topic we haven't covered yet, but still a very important one. Hope to see you there. Have a great rest of your week.